All right, so we're back and ready to get our hands dirty with some more JavaScript.
Yeah.
And today,
Yeah.
I'm excited because we're going to talk about functions and control flow.
Absolutely.
And I think this is where things start to get really interesting because we've
Yeah.
talked about, like, the raw materials of JavaScript, like,
Yeah.
the variables, the data types, the operators.
Building block.
Yeah, exactly, the building blocks. But now we're actually going to learn how to build something with those building blocks.
Yeah, exactly. So now we're going beyond just, okay, we can store information, we could do some basic arithmetic,
Yeah.
but how do we actually make our program do something?
Yeah.
Like, how do we make it make decisions? How do we repeat actions? How do we really build something that's dynamic and interactive?
So let's start with functions, because I know functions are like these blocks of code that can be reused
Yeah.
and that are designed to perform specific tasks.
Reusable blocks of code, exactly.
Yeah.
They're often described as, think of a coffee machine. You don't have to rebuild the coffee machine every time you want a cup of coffee. You just press a button and you get your desired outcome.
Right, and that's a good analogy. And it also highlights why functions are so important because it prevents us from having this, like, code clutter.
Exactly.
Or repeating the same code
Yeah.
over and over again. So it helps with organization,
Oh, sorry.
helps with the readability.
Maintainability,
Yeah.
and just the overall structure of your code.
Yeah. Can you walk me through, like, what the basic structure of a function looks like in JavaScript?
Yeah, so the basic structure, you start with the keyword function. So you say function, and then you give your function a name. Let's say calculate shipping, for example, if we're calculating the shipping cost for an order. And then you have parentheses. And inside the parentheses, you can optionally have what are called parameters, which are like the inputs to your function. Think of them like ingredients in a recipe. And then you have curly braces. And inside the curly braces, that's where the actual code for your function goes, like the steps in the recipe.
Mm-hmm.
And that code block is what gets executed when you call your function.
Oh, okay. So it's like the parameters are like the inputs.
Inputs, exactly.
And then the code block is like, okay, what do we actually do
Yeah.
with those inputs?
What happens when you call this function?
I see. So you mentioned there's different types of functions, right?
Yes, there are a few different ways you can define functions in JavaScript.
Okay.
You've got your kind of classic function declarations, where you say function, and then the name, and then the parameters. Then you have what are called function expressions, where you're basically assigning a function to a variable.
Oh, okay.
And then there are these things called arrow functions, which were introduced in ES6,
Yeah.
which offer a more concise syntax for defining functions.
I've seen those. Yeah. They're all over the place.
They are, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's what makes it look so much more modern, right?
It does. It
Yeah.
does. It's a very, it's very common to see arrow functions
Yeah.
in modern JavaScript code.
Now, I have to admit, sometimes I get a little tripped up with how arrow functions handle this.
Ah, yes. This.
Ugh.
The infamous this keyword.
Yeah, the dreaded this keyword. Can you maybe explain that in a way?
It can be
That makes sense, yeah.
a little tricky. So this, in JavaScript, the way this works can be very context dependent. It depends on how the function is called. But with arrow functions, they don't have their own this binding. They inherit this from the surrounding context. So it can behave a little differently than you might expect if you're coming from a background in other programming languages.
Oh, so it's like arrow functions kind of just inherit this from wherever they are.
Exactly, from the enclosing scope, yeah.
Okay, I think I'm getting it, but we might need to circle back to that.
Yeah, we can
Thumbs up,
get into
thumbs
that
down.
when we talk more about
Yeah,
scope and context.
awesome. Before we move on to control flow, I think you mentioned something earlier about higher order functions.
Yes, I did.
Is that something that, like, builds on top of functions?
So higher order functions, they're kind of like functions on steroids,
Okay.
I guess you could say. Because they're functions that can either accept other functions as arguments,
Whoa.
or they can return functions as results.
Oh, that's wild. So they can work with other functions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we'll have to dig into that later. I think that might be
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to
a
those.
little bit more of an advanced topic.
They're very powerful, but yeah, we'll save those for a little bit later.
Awesome. So I think let's move on to control flow now.
Okay, sounds good. Control flow,
Yeah.
this is where things get even more interesting.
Yeah, this is where we really get to the, like, intelligence, like the decision making
Yeah.
of JavaScript, I think.
Yeah,
So I'm excited to dig into that.
absolutely. So control flow. Ready to add some logic to your JavaScript toolkit?
Yeah, I'm ready. So we talked about functions being like these building blocks of code.
Right, reusable building block.
Right. So how does control flow kind of play into that? Like, where does it fit in?
Yeah, so think of it this way. Functions are the tools in your toolbox. You know, you got your hammer, your screwdriver, your saw. Control flow is like the blueprint, the instructions that tell you when to use which tool and in what order to build something.
Oh, okay. So it's like the logic
Exactly. It's the logic, the decision-making.
that tells our program how to flow from one step to the next.
Exactly. It determines how your code is executed, and it allows you to create programs that respond dynamically to different situations.
Gotcha. So what are some of the tools we have in JavaScript for controlling the flow of our code?
So one of the most fundamental control flow statements is the if statement.
Okay.
The if statement is like a gatekeeper. It checks a condition, and if that condition is true, it lets the code inside the if block execute. If it's false, it skips it.
So it's like a yes or no, basically. Like,
Exactly. A yes or no.
do we do this or do we skip it?
Exactly. So think of it like a bouncer at a club.
Okay.
The if statement is checking your ID. If you're old enough, you can come in. If not, you got to go home.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
makes it very clear. So what if we have a situation where it's not just a yes or no, but there are multiple possibilities?
Right. So for those cases, you have the else if and the else statement. So you can chain together a bunch of if statements with else if in between. And then finally, you can have an else block at the end that will execute if none of the previous conditions were true.
So it's like you're checking one condition and then another
Exactly.
until you finally find one that's true.
Exactly. And then if none of them are true, then you have your fallback plan,
Your fallback plan. Yeah.
which is the else block.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got if statements for making decisions. Are there any other tools we can use to control the flow of our code?
Yes, there are. So another really important concept in control flow is loops.
Hooray.
Loops allow you to repeat a block of code multiple times.
Oh, so that's how we can like automate things, right?
Exactly. Loops are essential for automating repetitive tasks, and they're also really useful for iterating over collections of data, like arrays.
Got it. Can you give me an example of that? Like, how would we use a loop to work with an array?
Sure. Let's say you have an array of numbers, and you want to calculate the sum of all the numbers in that array. You could use a loop to iterate through each element of the array, add it to a running total, and then at the end of the loop, you would have the sum of all the numbers.
Oh, so the loop is going through each element in the array.
One by one, yeah.
And then doing something with it.
And then doing something with it, exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what kind of loops do we have in JavaScript?
So there are a few different types of loops.
Hmm.
One of the most common ones is the for loop.
Okay.
The for loop is like a really well-defined controlled loop where you specify a starting point, an ending point, and how much you want to increment or decrement by each time you go through the loop.
Okay, so it's like setting a specific range.
Exactly, a specific range, and you know exactly how many times the loop is going to run.
So it's very predictable.
It's very predictable, yes.
Gotcha. What if we don't know how many times we need to loop?
Right, so for those cases, you have the while loop.
Okay.
The while loop will keep running as long as a certain condition is true.
So it's like keep going until this is no longer the case.
Exactly. So it's a bit more flexible than the for loop
Okay.
because you don't have to know in advance how many times it's going to run.
I see. So it's good for situations where things are a little more unpredictable.
Exactly.
Are there any other types of loops we should be aware of?
Yeah, there are a couple more that are really useful, particularly when you're working with arrays or objects. So there's the for.of loop,
Sure.
and that one is specifically designed for iterating over the elements of an array. It gives you each element one at a time, and you don't have to worry about messing with indices or anything like that.
So it's like it just handles all the messy details of like keeping track of where you are in the array and just gives you the element you need.
Exactly. It's a very clean and convenient way to loop through an array.
Very cool. And what about the last type?
The last one is the for.in loop, and that one is used for iterating over the properties of an object. So if you have an object and you want to see all the keys and values that are inside that object, you can use a for.in loop for that.
Okay, so it's like, show me everything that's inside this object.
Exactly. It gives you a way to access all the properties.
Gotcha. So we have for loops for when we know exactly how many times we want to loop, while loops for when it's a little more unpredictable.
Right.
And then we've got these special loops for working with arrays and objects.
Exactly.
I think that pretty much covers it, right? Or are there...
That covers the main types of loops that you'll
Yeah.
encounter in JavaScript.
Awesome. This is all starting to make so much sense. Like I'm seeing how functions,
Yeah.
control, flow statements, loops, they all kind of work
We
together
all fit together,
just to
yeah.
create these like really dynamic programs. It's like we're building this machine and each part has its own specific function.
That's a great way to think about it. And speaking of making sure your machine runs smoothly, let's talk about some common pitfalls and best practices when you're working with functions and control flow, because there are definitely some things that can trip you up if you're not careful.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that. I want to avoid any like facepalm moments where I realize, oh, I did this thing wrong and now my code's broken.
Exactly, exactly. So one of the biggest things to understand, especially when you're dealing with functions, is the concept of scope.
Okay. Scope. Now, I think you mentioned that before. Can you remind me what that is?
Yeah, so scope basically refers to where a variable is accessible in your code. It's like a set of rules that determine which parts of your code can see a particular variable.
So it's like not all variables are visible everywhere.
Exactly, exactly. So for example, variables that are declared inside a function,
Okay.
they have what's called function scope. That means they're only accessible inside that function. They're like little secrets that only the function knows about.
Oh, so they're like little private variables
Private variables, exactly.
for that function.
Right. Whereas variables that are declared outside of any function,
Okay.
those have what's called global scope, and those are accessible from anywhere in your code.
So global scope is like everyone can see it.
Yeah. Everyone can see it, yeah.
And function scope is like only this function can see it.
Exactly.
Okay. Why is it so important to understand the difference between those two?
So, if you're not careful about scope, you can accidentally create variables with the same name in different parts of your code.
Oh.
That can lead to some really confusing bugs.
So it's like you think you're changing one variable, but you're actually changing a different one.
Exactly, because they have the same name, but they're in different scopes.
Yikes. That sounds messy.
It can be, yeah. So a good practice is to be very mindful of where you're declaring your variables.
Okay.
And if you only need a variable inside a specific function,
Yeah.
declare it inside that function. Don't declare it globally unless you absolutely have to.
Got it. So keep things organized and avoid those naming collisions. What other best practices should we keep in mind?
Another one that can really trip people up is excessive nesting.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that earlier, like too many loops and if statements inside each other.
Exactly, exactly. And it's not that nesting is inherently bad. Sometimes you need it. But if you have too many levels of nesting, it can make your code really hard to read.
Yeah, it's like those Russian nesting dolls.
Yeah, it gets really complicated.
You open one and there's another one inside.
Exactly. It's hard to follow the logic. So a good way to avoid that is to try to break down complex tasks into smaller, more manageable functions. So if you have a big chunk of code that's doing a lot of things,
Yeah.
see if you can split it up into smaller functions that each do one specific thing.
Okay, so it's like divide and conquer.
Exactly. Divide and conquer.
Make things more modular,
And more readable. Yeah,
easier to understand.
absolutely.
Okay. Anything else we should keep in mind when it comes to best practices?
One more thing that's particularly relevant to loops is the use of constant labeling for variable declarations.
Okay, you mentioned those before. So what's the difference between those and var? Like, why should we use those instead of var?
So constant let were introduced in ES6, which is a newer version of JavaScript, and they offer some improvements over var in terms of scope and how variables are handled. So with var, you can redeclare a variable multiple times, and that can sometimes lead to unexpected behavior. With constant let, you can't do that. Once you declare a variable with const or let, it can't be redeclared.
That's like more strict.
More strict, exactly.
Right.
And that could help prevent some common errors.
Got it. So we should generally stick to using constant let instead of var.
Yeah, in most cases, const and let are the preferred way to declare variables.
Awesome. Wow, this is all super helpful. I'm feeling so much more confident about writing clean and efficient JavaScript code.
That's great to hear. And remember, like with anything in programming, practice makes perfect. So the more you write code,
Yeah.
the more you'll get a feel for these best practices and how to apply them.
Okay, so keep practicing, keep experimenting.
Exactly.
This has been an amazing deep dive so far. I feel like I've learned so much.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
But before we wrap things up entirely, I'm curious to hear more about those higher order functions you mentioned earlier.
Yes, higher order functions. Those are definitely a topic that deserves its own deep dive.
Okay, perfect. Let's take a quick break and then come back for one last round to explore those mysterious and powerful functions. Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle those those higher order functions you mentioned earlier. I'm excited to finally unlock this secret level of JavaScript.
They are pretty cool, yeah. They really can level up your coding skills and make your code a lot more efficient and elegant.
So just to recap, higher order functions are functions that can take other functions as arguments or return functions as results. Yeah.
Exactly. They're like functions that operate on other functions, which might sound a bit abstract at first.
It does, yeah. Can you give me a real world scenario where we might use a higher order function?
Absolutely. Imagine you have an array of product prices, and you want to calculate the sales tax for each one.
Okay, I'm following so far.
Now, one way to do this is to write a for loop. Go through each price in the array, calculate the sales tax, and update the array or create a new one with the updated prices. The way we've been doing things so far.
Right, that makes sense. But I'm guessing there's a more, I don't know, sleek way to do it with higher order functions.
Exactly. There's a higher order function called map that's perfect for this. Instead of writing the loop ourselves, we can use map to apply a function to each element in the array, in this case our tax calculation, and it automatically creates a new array with the updated prices.
Wait, so we don't even have to write the loop?
Nope. Map takes care of all that for us behind the scenes.
That is so cool. It's like we're delegating that repetitive task to map and just focusing on the core logic of calculating the tax.
Exactly. It makes your code so much cleaner and more readable. And the cool thing is, map isn't limited to just numbers. You can use it to transform any type of data in an array.
So we could apply any function we want to each element in the array.
Pretty much, yeah. It opens up a lot of possibilities.
Wow, I'm starting to see how higher order functions can really change the way we think about solving problems in JavaScript.
Absolutely. It's like moving from manual labor to using power tools. It makes you a lot more efficient and allows you to build more complex things.
So is map the only higher order function we have at our disposal?
Oh, not at all. There are a bunch of other powerful ones. Another one you'll use a lot is filter.
Filter, okay. What does that one do?
As the name suggests, it filters an array. You give it a function that defines the filtering criteria, and it creates a new array containing only the elements that pass that criteria.
So if we wanted to find all products that are on sale, for example.
Exactly. You could use filter to create a new array containing only those sale products. No need to write a loop with an if statement inside. Filter handles all that for you.
I'm loving these higher order functions. They're like little code ninjas that take care of all the tedious work.
I know, right? And there's one more I want to tell you about called reduce.
Okay, reduce. What does that one do?
Reduce is a bit more complex, but incredibly powerful. It allows you to combine all the elements in an array into a single value.
Combine them how? Like add them all together?
That's one possibility, but it can do much more. You can define any logic you want to combine the elements. For example, you could use it to find the maximum value in an array or concatenate strings.
So it's like a super versatile tool that can process an entire array and give us a single result.
You got it.
These higher order functions are blowing my mind. I'm already thinking of all the ways I can use them to simplify my code and make it more powerful.
That's the beauty of them. Once you understand the concept, it unlocks a whole new level of programming possibilities.
This whole deep dive has been such an eye-opener. We started with the basic building blocks of JavaScript, then explored how to control the flow of our programs, and now we've reached this higher level of abstraction with higher order functions.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's still so much more to learn and explore in the world of JavaScript.
I can't wait to continue this journey and see what other amazing things we can build with this language. Thanks for being such an awesome guide.
It's been my pleasure. Keep that curiosity burning, and you'll be amazed at what you can achieve.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of JavaScript. We hope you've learned a ton and are feeling inspired to keep coding and pushing your skills to new heights. Until next time,